Good morning and welcome to Sunday morning at the Marxist Forum. Now we started off as a brick and mortar Marxist library, but now we're on Zoom. We've been on Zoom since COVID, so I should say good afternoon and good evening for those of you in other time zones. My name is Roger Harris. I'm with the program committee, and we call ourselves the Institute for the Critical Study of Society, the ICSS. And these weekly programs are organized by us, and we've been doing that for nearly 2 decades. So this is a long time event. And you can sign up for our notifications for future programs, view past programs, and contact us through our website. And our website is icsmarks.org. And we very much appreciate our donations because we have some minor costs. And we also welcome feedback. And the website is excellent for seeing the archive of past presentations, which include YouTube videos and links to those videos. And this session too will be on a video, and that will be up in a day or two. So I very much invite you to look at our website. And for today, I would remind everybody that this is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. And as such, we would like to show respect for the participants. We spent a lot of time over the years developing a culture of comradely discussion. And with that said, I'll introduce our topic. Our topic is a vital topic for today, and that is the role of China and Russia in the anti-imperialist struggle. Now, China's emergence as an economic powerhouse has been a game changer in the world scale today. And as a game changer, China has been a lifeline for many of the countries in the global south. Russia is a country that actually doesn't claim to be building or working towards socialism, but note that it is the most sanctioned country by the imperialists. So they must know something. And to tell us about what they know and what we should know is our speaker, Sara Flounders. And I'm just delighted that Sara will be rejoining us. She's been a regular at the Marxist Forum, and we're so happy that she's come back today. She's a longstanding political activist and author based in New York City. She is the contributing editor to the Workers' World newspaper. She's the leader in UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition, the International Action Center, and the Sanctions Kill campaign. And if you can share the screen, Raj, and show Sara's latest book that she is the co-editor of, and she is the editor or co-editor of a number of publications, including this most recent one, which is not yet out, but is in galley proofs. The China Changes Everything. And she's also, previous books include Capitalism on a Ventilator, the impact of COVID-19 on China and the U.S. sanctions, and then on the U.S. And another book that she's a co-editor of is Sanctions, a Wrecking Ball in a Global Economy. So if we could end screen sharing and invite Sara to begin her presentation. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the role of the anti-imperialist struggle. So Sara, it's all yours.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you to the Marxist Forum. And I am going to go off topic from the role of China and Russia and the anti-imperialist struggle to start with, and because I want to begin with a salute to Gaza and to resistance today. Really, it's the United Palestinian Resistance Movement that said in their statement, resistance will continue in all its forms. So I really want to address that today because the resistance accomplished what the Zionists and US imperialism said they would never allow. The resistance survived as still armed, cohesive force with overwhelming support of the population. Now, Netanyahu and Trump had both demanded that Hamas and every group in Gaza must be disarmed, defeated, disbanded, that all the Palestinians would be relocated, driven out of Gaza. Do you remember Netanyahu's boast, his map at the UN with no Palestine? And they all said again and again they would never meet, never negotiate with Hamas. Well, they failed. They failed. They failed on every front. And so today, if we're discussing anything in the world, I think we have to start with this huge development. Israel achieved none of its goal, and it is hated and isolated around the world. Palestine is embraced by the world, and it will be rebuilt by Palestinians. What an accomplishment. There'll be no Trump Tower in Gaza. Now, what else failed? Israel is the greatest recipient of U.S. Aid in U.S. history, year after year, the greatest recipient of total U.S. aid. Between 1946 and 2024, received $228 billion in military aid from the U.S. That's over $300 billion adjusted for inflation. But that's enough to cover healthcare in the U.S. for many years. But it went to this war machine. $300 billion, and the Zionists, IDF super military couldn't defeat the most isolated, impoverished, surrounded population. Now, the U.S. was the first country to recognize the state of Israel back in 1948. It's, as I say, received hundreds of millions of dollars. They fund the arms. They fund the Zionist settlers in the West Bank. So this is also not only a stunning failure for the Zionists, it's a stunning U.S. failure. All those tens of billions of dollars, all those weapons to this U.S. proxy are worthless. So, and at the same time, if we're going to talk about other things that failed, the surprise attack, Israel's surprise attack on Iran, when Iran was negotiating with the U.S. and Trump bragged, oh, they set up Iran for that hit. But it didn't bring down didn't create regime change in Iran. It failed. There was a surprise attack on Yemen that killed the prime minister and the entire cabinet in Yemen. It was a desperate effort to break the resistance in Yemen, but it also failed. So we have this totally dependent entity of Western imperialism ever since the Balfour Declaration. It was a British proxy, then a U.S. tool. It has no independent existence. And I want to really start with that because it does show the limitations of U.S. power today. They since October 7th of 2 years ago, they gave additional backing to Israel of another $22 billion. That's on top of the $3.8 billion a year Israel is guaranteed to receive every single year. So, and by the way, it's not only military aid. We could talk about the role of Israeli bonds that banks but also nonprofits and unions and universities and educational foundations compete with each other, Democrat and Republican, to put more and more money into Israeli bonds. And that is public money overwhelmingly. They use it as a giant hedge fund to invest in Israel. There's over 90 US state and municipal pension and treasury funds that have invested billions in Israeli bonds. Universities, the same thing. They're used like just a big slush fund, and they purchase Israeli bonds and invest in the Israeli stock market. It's why it's a high-tech center, because they know they can get money from the U.S. from all of these big slush funds, which is how they treat our pensions and all of our institutions. Now, all of this was because Israel was their unsinkable aircraft carrier, and it's not doing very well. I want to say one other point before I go on to the topic at hand, but I think it means a lot when we think of the power that both Trump today, when he says he's going to move forces into every city and he's going to do this, he's going to do that. There are limitations in US power, and they can talk big, but their ability to deliver. Now, the media is their ultimate weapon. It's their most powerful. It's really that war for people's hearts and minds. And supposedly it's all powerful. They control every arm of the US corporate media. They shut down tens of thousands of Facebook and YouTube and Instagram and X across not only the United States, but globally. If they were critical of Israel, boom, your site could disappear overnight. And yet, this enormous movement grew up that is in solidarity with Palestine. And in every poll, the majority of the population today, and the majority, by the way, of Jewish youth, different from their parents, now support Palestine. So there are big changes taking place, and they can think they control the media and the weapons, but there are subterranean changes happening that we need to be aware of without being giddy about it. But they have failed, and the limits of US imperialist power are being exposed in ways that we wouldn't have foreseen 2 years ago. Today, overwhelmingly, the world stands with Gaza, and that's true in flotillas, in strikes, in shutdowns. A general strike in Italy, not on bread and butter or austerity issues, but for Palestine. That's a whole new level of internationalism. And that a kind of internationalism is being revived. So we shouldn't underestimate our power, whether it's dock workers refusing arms shipments or healthcare workers denouncing hospital bombings or artists boycotting cultural exchanges. There's a new kind of solidarity. And especially you see that internationalism in youth and in rising new kind of workers' movements. So I'll go on from there, but I want to sort of close or transition to the next way by saying that imperialism today operates less through colonies and more through blockades and sanctions and debt traps and covert regime change operations. And against this mounting attack, which is really an apparatus of fragmentation, only internationalism can provide cohesive alternatives. So it's good for us to think in global terms. Does Palestine impact Russia, impact China, impact what's happening in Bangladesh or Nepal? I mean, these things are so interconnected in a global economy. Supporting people's right to resist, it's always been a task, an obligation of a global movement, more and more of all forces that are seeking liberation. So there's a global shift in political consciousness going on. There's a deeper understanding of imperialism and colonialism and Zionism as tools of the West. And in this shift, we want to just keep thinking about what it means. I don't have time to go into all of this. I was speaking on it earlier today a little bit more. But there's another shift. There's 2 years of appeals were to the big imperialist powers to break with Israel. There were endless appeals to the US and the EU to rein in Israel, to stop the bombing and allow the food and supplies in. But now, large and small, from a flotilla of small boats to cheering Yemeni missiles, there is a new level of understanding that it's got to come from below, from people's power, that there's no mercy from the imperialists, that any gain will be based on collective determination, the strength of demands and mobilization that come from below. So, you know, there's been efforts to shut down solidarity at every level. I think everyone here knows people who've been fired, suspended, fined, whether it's teachers or staff or laid off. Thousands of people have lost their social media posts, but there's a growing awareness of people's power. So let's be really conscious of this. I don't want to take all my time on this, but there's no crime that they won't commit, and there's every reason for us to mobilize. Now, I had discussed with Roger, though, China's emergence as an economic powerhouse is a game changer on a world scale. So let me just switch to that, because China is the big change in the world today. And so understanding some of that, I think, is very, very helpful. So we could go from the small Gaza, with 2 million people, even in the midst of complete ruin, are able to accomplish, into China as an economic powerhouse, once the poorest country of the world, completely broken apart, looted by the imperialists, colonized in 100 ways, the drug trade that went so deep, and now an economic powerhouse. We got to look at even what the Belt and Road Initiative means. 120 trading partners around the world, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, plus more and more countries joining this trade alliance. And there's numerous bilateral trade agreements. They're an alternative to the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and all these brutal structural adjustment and privatization programs that seemed like there was no way that countries in Africa or in Latin America could get out from under. And now there's real options in the world. And that changes a lot. As I say, it's changing consciousness on a global scale. Every international gathering or trade agreement or aid shipment confirms that China is a lifeline for the global South. And this challenges US hegemony. Now, just as Ray's, and I will get to it, Russia is a country that doesn't claim to even be building towards socialism. But for survival from the heaviest US EU sanctions that have ever been imposed anywhere, they have had to renationalize many industries and the banks totally, and raw materials, all kinds of things in trade and shipping. So it turned out that sanctions on Russia hit the Western-oriented capitalists the harshest. And Russia was able to pivot into a whole new world of economic relations that are very helpful, particularly with China, but not only, with all the BRICS countries. And the whole system of Western franchises, the whole Western-oriented managerial layer in Russia, who had administrated whole industries in Russia, they were wiped out. They were the ones wiped out by the West, hoping that the shock would collapse the government. If you can remember back to Biden, this is now 4 years back, saying that the ruble would become rubber overnight, and that did not happen. So I want to look at some of that too, these, when we talk about profound changes on a global scale, because, you know, that's part of the changes happening. So let's see where I'm at on my notes here. Sorry. I'm trying to bring in several things, and I hope folks here can sort of follow what I'm trying to do. But it's really about the old order in decline and looking at things in a global way, looking at these new political alliances, diplomatic alliances, military alliances. There's a whole swath of nations that are called now the Global South, and they are struggling to emerge from a whole past of imperialist pillage and colonial looting and grinding poverty. And they're doing it by increasingly pulling together. We could look at the Sahel Alliance, so exciting, as a development of countries of Africa, literally the poorest, pulling together, and also looking to both China and Russia for new ways of staying together, free of French or US imperialism. So these are really progressive developments that are happening right in the backyard It's happening also across Latin America, where the threats on Venezuela have reached an extreme level of daily threats of shooting small boats, no questions asked, just massacres, assassinations, and the threat to do much worse. So let me go back to China and what role it plays in all this. China's advantage, just a minute. Arises from this sharp difference in two wholly different ways of organizing society. And that's the main thing I think I want to stress here. That in the United States, all resources are privately owned by a handful of billionaires. Even public forests, water, raw materials, even a public hospital, everything it buys is from private companies. Everything in the US is open to exploitation for private profit. In China, the overwhelming bulk of resources, and that means oil and gas and coal and coal mines and gem and rare earth and water, land, are socially owned and used for the development of the whole society. So it's the difference in ownership that impacts further modernization and the ability to adapt to new technology in two different societies. So it's really, there's class and property differences between People's China and US imperialism, and also People's China and all the imperialist countries of the West. Let me say how that plays out. Cooperation in a global market, because ruthless competition for profit, now that's the fundamental feature of capitalism, it disrupts all cooperative work that's needed to solve the enormous environmental and social problems that confront the whole planet. In fact, a higher stage of industrial and technical development in a more complex society actually requires a higher stage of social organization, if you think about it. So, since the capitalists employ little to no planning, capitalism can't solve the overarching problems that humanity is facing on a global scale. I think everyone knows here, it's beyond dispute the US living standards, quality of life that's measured in healthcare, in education, in housing, in infrastructure are in sharp decline. And the capitalists here are really incapable of solving that or engaging in any planning to solve it. The CEOs, board of directors have to base their decisions on maximizing profit in the shortest term. If they fail, they'll lose their position. Market cycles, not human needs, drive every decision. What's produced and how and what can be immediately sold for a profit. So back to how did China change this? And what happened in China that makes it so different and able to plan? It was really the Chinese Revolution that shook the world. It was an upheaval. It aroused the workers and peasants globally, across the whole world. There was a great excitement at the Chinese Revolution. It was led by the Communist Party of China, which broke with the dominant imperialist powers that had looted China. And there was an all-out effort to strangle that revolution. The US and its allies walled China off from all Western trade and technology during its first 30 years of existence. It was complete sanctions. When we look at the impact of sanctions today on Cuba, on Venezuela, on Iran, the sanctions on China were total. But nevertheless, during that time, the Communist Party was able to reorganize agriculture, basic industries. They had survived decades of civil war and Japanese and Western colonial occupation. They collectivized the land. And they enthusiastically ripped out the old feudal landlord system. They broke its back. I mean, they ripped it out root and branch. That made a big difference. But 30 years of sanctions, in 1978, they made a decision for a compromise. The world was dominated by monopoly capital that was also changing fast. Technology they didn't have access to. It was a question how to get the access. So they focused, beginning in 1978, intensively on their own internal development and on gaining Western investment. They opened up the China's economy to really hostile class elements. And Western investments came in with money, machinery, technology, and skills. They flooded into China. And they also created a new domestic capitalist class. That's a contradiction. It's good to know that. Now, China calls this stage socialism with Chinese characteristics. They admit it's a compromise. And it's an important thing if we're defending China today to recognize there's a socialist base to the Chinese economy, and there's a strong leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, 100 million members strong now, and they're determined to build an economy of a new type. But they say this is not a finished product. They're building towards socialism. They use that term, where they say we're in the primary stage of socialism. They say this is not yet a fully developed socialist country with equality for all. So this phrase, socialism with Chinese characteristics, or describing market socialism, socialism with a market, think of all those terms. It is a market, but it's built on socialist pillars, and it's people-oriented, central planning that remains decisive step by step. There is a controlled capitalist market, while at the same time there's state ownership of all the major industries and banks. And it's led by a communist party of 100 million members that has cells elected from within its ranks at virtually every workplace, every neighborhood, every school, every department, who are really committed to defending socialist property and very determined to protect Chinese sovereignty. It's a backbone of the whole social programs. Now, I say that about China. How do we understand Russia today? Not a socialist country. The United States imperialists, the strategists, and the NATO planners, and the whole NATO military alliance felt that the way to block China's development, that the road to intervention and dislocation of China was a regime change in Russia, and they thought it would be easy picking. They really assumed that the sanctions would work immediately, that Russia would collapse in terms of the war in Ukraine, where they took more and more land, expropriated Russian-speaking Ukrainians, fired directly into Russia, and so on. Everything they could to bring in an intervention, and then massive sanctions on Russia. They thought this would collapse. And they were also enthusiastically for it because Russia is a rich source of raw materials. If it could be dismembered, then China's trade and development would be stopped across thousands of miles of common border and throughout Central Asia, and they would be able to continue to pillage. So, and also the expansion of NATO into a global police force was the aim, but none of that happened. Nothing went according to the imperialist plan. So now we have war in Ukraine, a NATO war that is going into the fourth year. No real end in sight, and certainly no victory for NATO. Now, with all this, I want to say that Russia's survival is entirely progressive, really a progressive world development. So it's how we see what's going on with the war in Ukraine. Is it good that Russia survived? Absolutely. Is it good that they drew the line at Ukraine? Absolutely. They felt there was no other way to defend Russia. If Ukraine, right into their heartland, was a NATO country, they would have no defense at all. So it's important at this time. What happened was there was a refusal by a whole block of countries, not only China, to abide by the US imposed sanctions on Russia. And that began to break the power of all the sanctions. There was a US NATO attempt to totally isolate and destabilize Russia. It completely failed, and Russia was able to pivot to the global south. Its gas, its oil, its wheat, its lumber. It's a valuable resource that found quick markets. Originally, if you think back 4 years, the US was predicting there would be famine throughout Africa because all the Russian wheat would be stopped, that prices would spike beyond over the top, and so on. Really, what happened was Western Europe lost access to low-cost energy of Russian gas, now pays a far higher price to use liquefied natural gas from the US. So the effort to impose a regime change on Russia has ended up with the European Union in economic disarray. The social programs in most of the EU countries are being ripped apart in order to pay for the NATO war machine. So before I go on further, I just want to repeat again about the economic size of Russia, because it's no longer the Soviet Union of the 1990s. It now is the economy of about Spain or Brazil, ranks 11th or 12th in economic standing. But it could not have survived without having markets and without the sanctions relief that China and other countries were able to give. So there's huge changes happening. I should actually be winding up, so there's time for Q&A. I see Roger coming on. Yes. So let me wind up on this. Where are things in Russia today? Russia, for its own survival, even though, as it says, it is a capitalist country, but it had to renationalize, and some things had stayed in Russian the hands of the had never been privatized. Other things have now been renationalized, but today it's all of banking, key economic sectors, including energy, all the defense industries, the entire infrastructure industries are state-owned. And since 2022 into the Ukraine, there was also a confiscation of assets of all the foreign companies that totally shut down business overnight. They thought that would lead to a complete shock in the Russian economy. For survival, they took it over. So oil and gas and companies, Gazprom, whatnot, major banks. Now, there was something else that happened. We could look at the defense conglomerates. I won't go into all this right now. We can go back to it in the Q&A. But there was a process of pushing out U.S. soft power that began 10 years earlier. And that is, there were a whole number of NGOs that had flooded into Russia. They had a huge impact. And by actually, they bragged about it at the time. There was a Yale Center for the Study of Globalization that said there were 600,000 registered NGOs in Russia, operating in Russia. They're very proud of that. And the communist forces in the Russian Duma, the elected assembly, began a nationwide campaign against foreign-funded NGOs that they must all register, and any foreign agents would be shut down. And this shut down more than 30% of the Russian NGOs. And it was the biggest blow to their, that was happened in 2012, 2013. So these things were happening beforehand, before actually, but happening because they were trying to break I'm going to skip the whole part on the attempted sanctions on Iran, but how it strengthened these relations. But let me just close by saying, the way I opened it, that there are profound changes on a global scale, and all the frantic efforts of Trump and the earlier Biden administration can't reverse it. The old order really is in decline, and it is a global struggle. So thank you. And I guess I didn't speak over. We
Thank you
can
very
open it
much.
for,
And that was a terrific presentation. I can't wait to the Q&A so that we can get into some of these things in more detail. But before we go into the Q&A, I wanted to announce what our next program will be. So please join us next Sunday. And this relates to China because think about very recently, China and India have come closer together. As soon as that happened, something happened in that part of the world. There was a revolution of sorts in Nepal. So, what did that revolution of sorts in Nepal mean? There's lots of different interpretations, and we've asked an expert to come in and try to explain the complexity of that situation. So, join us next week when Kit Clarenberg will be our presenter. Kit is a British anti-imperialist journalist. He writes for the Gray Zone and the Mint Press News. So now we'll do the Q&A, and for those of you who are not familiar with our protocol, we ask you to raise your hand by going to the reaction thing and raising your hand, clicking on your hand, and I will call people, and you will have 2 minutes to make a presentation, to ask a question, to make a point, whatever. And then Sarah will get her chance to respond, and we'll do that one person at a time. So let me take a look at what hands are up, and I will call Daniel Borgstrom first. So Daniel, if you could please unmute yourself.
Yes. Can you hear me first?
Very well, thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, first, thank you very much for your informative presentation. And my comment is that comment and question is, I hear very little about what goes on inside uh, uh, Russia. This about what you've just said is news to me. And I mean, I look at alternative websites. That's where I get my information. But there's practically nothing about what goes on in China like this. They're nationalized, how they responded to the sanctions, uh, any of this. And I wonder why and where can we go for information, such as you've just presented. More of it, I mean. Thank you.
do we want to do a few questions before?
No, we do them one question at a time because it's more
okay.
interactive that way. So thank you.
Okay. All right. I actually started just, how do you say, Googling, looking up what's nationalized now in Russia. And came up with a really interesting list, went back. Most of it was Western economic sites. Of course, I was following this intensely for the book that we did on sanctions, a wrecking ball on a global economy. We were putting that out at the beginning of, the Russia's intervention into Ukraine, NATO's response, and had been writing and following from 2014 the effort really to grab a hold of Ukraine and quite a number of other countries securely into NATO. So there were defensive measures taking place, which I think do need much, much more study because these industries now are nationalized. What it means, because it's not, as I say, led by a communist party, but there is a real mix in the Duma today, and the strongest party, both Putin's party and the communists, who actually pushed the strongest for action to be taken in Ukraine, by the way. So we don't know all the implications of this. We do know that there was 70 years of socialist ownership in Russia and a whole education of generations who were for the Soviet Union. And its breakup, they really mourn, they do. And the breakup into the individual republics that impoverished the sort of surrounding states, which now are reconnecting to Russia in all different ways too. So I think it's a process. I really wish I could spend more time on it because the economic implications of this, and I don't speak Russian, but I speak to a lot of people. And what is now nationally owned is in fact true, and you can look that up very easily. Yeah.
Thank you. So our next questioner is Dr. Koo, followed by Virginia Browning. So Dr. Koo, it's all yours.
Thank you, Sarah. My question is this: China just placed a tighter ban on its rare earth metals. The Western media portrayed this as a surprise and accused China as the aggressor. Can you please discuss the background, not made privy to us, on the continuous provocation, like the fines on Chinese ships or the bans of certain Chinese companies in spite of the facade of tariff war cessation in Geneva? Thank you.
Well, yeah, the ban on rare earth minerals, which China said was a response to US imposed sanctions. And by the way, the sanctions were on everything to do with technology. There was a very productive trade between the United States and China in all forms of high-tech fields. That slammed closed. Now, turned out China was able to develop some of its own technology pretty quickly, which was not expected by the US, but there are all kinds of chips that came from Taiwan into China. And when that was ordered cut, that really hurt, by the way, the economy in Taiwan also. And that they must build plants here in the US, which is a process that will take many years. China went full steam toward developing its own chip technology. The same thing happened with Huawei and sort of the next generation in terms of phone. That was banned. And at that time, China said, well, if we are sanctioned, sanctions will be returned also in vital industries. So rare earth minerals is an area that takes a high level of scientific training. And as a matter of fact, China has a whole number of universities that specialize in this. It's something they have developed over 20 and 30 years. And it was sort of almost a Wild West industry for a while, but now it's fully mechanized. And the refining takes really hundreds of steps from rare earth minerals into these tiny magnets that are essential in computerized everything. China has the technology. It really doesn't exist in other places in the world. I think something like 90% of what even the US needs for its military comes from China, from rare earth minerals that are refined into these tiny magnets. So China's ban is a reciprocation of US imposed tariffs. They said they would do it. They would choose an industry that what the US did to them was as painful, and each thing the US does will be met. They said how it could be lifted if sanctions were ended, but instead there's a doubling down, and now Trump has announced 100% tariff on everything. Well, that immediately hurt farmers in the US that sold most of their soybean crop to China, and now China is buying that from Brazil, Argentina, from other countries, and will have to bail out US farmers at a cost of billions of dollars by the way, that's why there isn't money to continue Medicare programs, because do subsidized corporate farming get it, or do we get it for our health care, or does it go to Israel? These are real choices in the world today, and they're making choices that are directly against us. But the rare earth minerals, they have absolutely restricted from foreign export.
Very good. Thank you. So next up is, let's see, Virginia, did you just go?
No, not yet. But, something happened here. I wonder if you can put me off for about 10 minutes.
Okay, so Jean, how about Jean Rule? And
Okay, I think I'm speaking now. But well, thank you so much, Sarah. This was really great. And I look forward to an amazing talk, and that's what you did. So thank you for that. And I'm speaking, I'm wearing my Vets for Peace cap here, and I think you're a member of our China working group, and we appreciate that. But I wanted to ask a question or talk a little bit about nuclear weapons with Chinese characteristics. Because China realized there was a nuclear threat, and it didn't try to compete with Russia or the United States in terms of volume of nuclear weapons, because they realized they couldn't do that. And so instead, they, Mao said something like, we need to have this, or else we will be bullied. And what they did is they decided they would not have a first strike capability. They would have the ability to respond to any nuclear attack on them. So they developed their nuclear weapons accordingly, and they placed them accordingly. But when they did this, they pledged, first of all, they would never initiate a nuclear war. And secondly, they would never use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear enemy. And these are characteristics of the Chinese approach to this very important reality we face here. And of course, the United States threatens the other countries all the time that don't have. Daniel Ellsberg has the 30 cases where we've used these nuclear weapons to threaten non-nuclear enemies who don't even know they're enemies yet. So at any rate, I just like to make that point and see if you have comments on that issue. And again, thank you.
Well, Eugene, that's a great point. And I'm not sure what else I could add, but it is, China states it again and again. They will never fire the first strike. The US will not have a second strike. They will hit back. US will be destroyed. And they've shown the capacity, and in their recent 80th year celebration of the defeat of Japanese imperialism, they showed these weapons in the street, described in detail what they would do, which is pretty horrific. And it was kind of sobering to the US, which continues its military buildup. But you really have to think, if they couldn't take on Afghanistan, Iraq, or even Gaza, how military planners, because there's money to be made, they'll continue planning for wars. They'll continue building weapons, but it is truly it's beyond criminally foolish. It is nuclear insanity. But China does have the capacity to strike back. And all of US nuclear threats have always been against non-nuclear countries. The countries that have the ability to hit back have, been able to survive. It's a deadly weapon. I don't know what more I could say, but it's important that they have that capacity, and we can only hope for the planet. Nothing ever comes to that.
Thank you. So next up is Eleazar Friedman, followed by Citizen of the Planet. Eleazar, it's all yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Thank you so much for that impassioned and brilliant talk. I want to add a few points, mainly in agreement. Your characterization of China, I call it a worker state with capitalist deformations, but still the Communist Party and collective property is the base. And even though there's huge capitalist investments in China, I think the communists worldwide have to defend the Chinese worker state. I know there's some people, ICSS, that feel otherwise, but I think it's an error. Number two, your position on the Russia-Ukraine NATO proxy provoked war. That is, they overthrew the government in 2014. But I want to add a point, just a nuance to your early discussion of U.S. imperialism and Zionism. The Soviet Union was also one of the first states to recognize the partition and support Israel. And in the Nakba, it was Russia that provided the weapons, not U.S. imperialism. They used Czechoslovakia as the transit point to ship their arms to Israel to fight in the Nakba. It was not U.S. imperialism. U.S. imperialism started arming them more from the 67 war. And any error I made, I'd be glad for you to refute. I don't mind making errors. I am not error proof. And again, thank you for characterizing China as a non-capitalist state. And Russia, we should add, is not an imperialist state. They're up against NATO U.S. imperialism, and they want to dismember Russia, like you said, and they want to build a NATO force in the Ukraine. So the Ukraine is a proxy war for U.S. and NATO imperialism. And I believe that's your thinking. And thank you very much. Really excellent talk.
Well, thank you, Elazar. And yeah, I think we're actually fundamentally in agreement on all these points. I will say it's truly both unfortunate that the Soviet Union at that time did recognize the state of Israel. I'll also say that this was 2 years out from the end of World War II, where the Soviet Union was completely decimated and had no thought except how to survive and reorganize itself. So their ability, looking at the world, looking at decisions and votes at that time, their expectation that something progressive should come out of this because of what the Holocaust was in Europe, it was totally off, and it had an impact on the communist parties throughout the Arab world because there was real anger about it, about that recognition. So it's not to be defended, but the idea that the arms came from Czechoslovakia, which was in complete ruin at that time, as was Russia. I don't think they were sending arms to anyone in 1948. But at any rate, at that time, very much the Israeli state and the Zionists were a British proxy, very well armed. At least I think that's pretty much backed up. But all right, I don't know all that happened, 80 years ago. But I think the fundamental point you raise is important, that Russia is not an imperialist state today. It's been cut off from every form of international banking, investment, and it's able to survive by trading its raw materials and by renationalizing essential industries. So we'll see where that goes and what the strength of the movement and a revival of the communist past could mean in Russia in the future. We don't know, but it's going in a better direction. It's going in a better direction than to join the G7. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Citizen was up next, but it looks like he has dropped out. So the stack now looks like Virginia is back. So Virginia will be the next one, followed by Janet. I'm going to push myself into that stack too. And then, oh, I see Roger's hand up, so he'll come on that stack as well. So Virginia, are you back?
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you
Great.
for that really, really informative talk, and so concise. So much I'd still like to learn. Now I have a friend who I mean I hear this point of view. I to what degree? Okay, this friend feels that the weapons industry, that countries mean relatively little now compared to things like the weapons industry, and that when it comes to things like this, Russia and the US are working together. Let me just simply put it that way, and you can correct anything. Thanks.
Well, I don't know what it would be based on that they're working together. It certainly doesn't look that way from anything that I could see. And I will say that the entire military industry in the US is for profit. And that drives war, because every war, even if it's a disastrous war in terms of US global interests, such as Afghanistan, nevertheless, there were billions of dollars to be made in a war and or lose. US private ownership of all the defense industries and the hundreds of thousands of subcontractors are also privately owned. That gives an entirely different direction to war. Now, in Russia, it's entirely nationalized. So weapons of defense are produced, and actually they're produced much more efficiently, more high tech. They've been able to do more things than the US could do because these industries aren't competing with each other. That makes a big difference. But they do know that US weapons want to destroy them. So I can't see where someone would assume they're working together. It's true they're both building weapons, but for very different purposes. The US weapons are for conquest, for imposing their markets around the world, and Russia's weapons are to defend Russia at this time as best they can.
Okay, Janet Coburn.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. I wanted to start with a comment regarding Gaza, which you talked about at the beginning. Yes, there is public support for Palestinian resistance, but many are celebrating Trump's so-called peace plan, for which phase one is bringing some initial relief, but there will likely be no agreement on phase two, which will result in a resumption of the genocide. And the other phases would result in another Oslo. And while on September 18th, 2024, the UN General Assembly adopted the ICJ's July 19th, 2024 advisory opinion that Israel's occupation of occupied Palestinian territory going back to 1967 is illegal, Trump's plan disregards that and would ultimately lead to a compounded occupation worse than the British mandate. I'll post that ICJ opinion in the chat. And interesting that Trump's buildup of US threats to Venezuela is accompanied by what I call Nobel War Prize being awarded to Maduro's political opponent and US lackey, Maria Corina Machado. That said, my question is about something different.
Janet,
all right.
Janet, just a second. Let me speak. Janet, let me speak. Janet,
may I ask my question?
Janet, let me speak for a second.
Okay.
Janet, let me speak for 1 second. We have a very short stack. Let Sarah answer this thing about Gaza, and
Really?
then
let me just ask my question, and she can.
Okay.
Okay. Whatever she wants. Um, I'd like her to talk about the recent Pakistan-Afghanistan conflict and how it impacts or might impact Russia and China.
Well, all right. I want to say something on the peace plan, and I could also touch on Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I think you'll also learn a lot on Nepal next week. But on the peace plan, no one knows if there'll be a phase 2, a phase 3. Clearly, it's like in any negotiation, even to save a union, whether you get a nickel or a dime more, the real question is, has the union survived? And what this stage shows is that the Palestinian resistance as an armed force that the Zionists had to sit down across the table and make an exchange with, they are not disarmed. And they recognize that there will be other phases, there will be other fighting. If there is a moment of relief for the population, they have every obligation to try to make sure that happens. That's the basis of their support, the population as a whole. They had been left completely out of the peace plan. In other words, there was a 20-point plan. All these countries got together and included not one Palestinian representative and said, you have 72 hours to completely disarm and accept this. And they managed to insert themselves and say, well, yes, we'll negotiate. Yes, we'll release prisoners. That's why always they were hostages, because we want at least 2,000 of our prisoners released. And that is what they're getting this stage. So it really shows that they have survived as a force, a coherent force, and that what the Israelis said they would never do has happened. So that's a big, big deal. Now, in terms of Pakistan and Afghanistan, I think everywhere that the US can use fragmentation and division or create wars, and Pakistan and India or Pakistan and Afghanistan are both prime targets. Anywhere that destabilization as a tactic can be used, anywhere in the world, they want to do. It could be Bangladesh, anywhere that has relations, Madagascar, that has relations with China, Tanzania. We could follow what's happening in the world today. If they can overturn a government, if they can make a chaotic situation, they want to, that's the US strategy everywhere. See if you can just upend the world. In other words, they can't offer development to any country, but if they can destabilize things, they feel that gives them time. So everywhere, when I look at destabilization, I think the US has a real hand in it. And everywhere you look at cooperative development, that is in China's interests, developing healthy trade relations, even with countries that between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Just stopping that hostility is changing a lot of things happening in West Asia. So you could look at every corner of the world. Peace benefits everyone, and war is always a loss and a gain only for the bigger powers that want to recolonize. So I hope that answers. But there will be other stages to this peace plan. We can't assume it's all over and solved, but the Palestinians have survived. And that is everything in terms of a resistance struggle.
Very, very good answer. The U.S. offers destabilization. The global South offers development, especially under China. Very good points. Thank you. Next up would be Raj Sahai, followed by Citizen, and then Jim.
In a very informative talk. My question to you is this. Now, back before Second World War, Germany had gone into the stage of fascism. Basically, it's to militarily break the barrier for German investments and profit making, which they could do in Eastern Europe more easily because England was such a powerful naval force. And today, this is also a stage of imperialism, as Lenin defines it. Finance capital becomes all powerful, and you can see what's going on. It's a speculation all around. The G7 countries, by and large, are in that state. But China is also, by the way, there is some overproduction situation in China developing. Now, China is not at all an imperialist country, I don't mean to suggest, but they have gone deep into capitalist mode of production. But that's not my focus of my question is, has the United States more or less reached the stage in which Germany was? Of course, the United States is not a fascist country like Germany, but is it now become important to defeat, by all means necessary, this power that has gone off into a destabilization situation like Germany had become a destabilizing force and very murderous force? What is your opinion of that? Thank you.
Well, the U.S. strategists, and Democrat and Republican, they're unanimous that China is the greatest threat they face globally and far into the future. And everything else they feel they could handle, they could have handled it, except there's this powerful other option in the world today. So they may think it's necessary to defeat China, but how they do that isn't so easy to figure out, because China is well defended and increasingly defended in whole new ways. And also China is well able, the US can bar its electric cars here, but they're the main car that's sold throughout Latin America and throughout whole parts of Africa today and Asia. So the US, in barring them and going ahead with gas-powered cars here, is only cutting their nose to spite their face, you could say. Now, the US does need markets. Capitalism must have markets or it dies. A planned economy doesn't have that same desperate financial need. There's no group of capitalists whose very survival depends on will they sell more cars or will they sell more electric or solar panels. It's not. When it's state-owned, there's the ability to produce cheaply, but your survival isn't based on do you have an immediate market. So they can sell solar panels so cheaply around the world, it's changing technology throughout Africa, as a matter of fact. We have very exciting articles on that on China Changes Everything, our new book, but about how just the ability of cheap technology to electrify whole countries where today there's still not electrification. And in the same way that phones, you no longer need phone lines. That's nice for us here in the West. But in whole parts of Asia and Africa, it means people now have instant communication that they never had before. And even the poorest now have little cell phones. So technology is changing things, and the ability to give that technology to developing countries is huge. And so the US has a big problem in that it can't sell its goods as competitively as China can. It's very anxious to stop China. How it will do that, we don't know. We don't know, and I don't know, at least, except to say that I think the working class movement here at least needs to know what side they're on. and how dangerous U.S. plans are.
Thank you. Next up is Citizen, followed by Jim.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, very well. Thank you, Jim. Citizen.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I had some technical difficulties that I didn't know how to resolve except by restarting my laptop. So I missed about the last 7 minutes of your talk, Sarah. Thank you very much for your very informative talk. I just want to say, the workers of the world, not even of the United States, unfortunately, don't seem to be very united at all, especially against Western imperialism. If I can, I'd like to sneak in 2 brief questions. One, with regard to your Workers' World article, and I find the articles in Workers' World very interesting, but I saw in the description of you in today's presentation that you have an article, U.S. Threats Against Korea in a Changing World. And so I was wondering why you said against Korea, because of course, unfortunately, Korea is divided into 2 countries. And my other very quick question, which I guess might be a good segue from Raj's question, are you predicting a U.S. war against China, and if so, by when? Thank you.
Well, huge questions here. Let's give it a try. First of all, U.S. war on Korea is the escalation of threats on the DPRK, on North Korea. But it is forcibly blocking South Korea's effort to normalize any kind of relations with North Korea. Just a few years ago, there was great excitement about reunification. Korea is one, and the U.S. stepped in. No way was that movement going to go forward. Instead, and Trump played a big role in this. He was going to bring peace. He made all kinds of promises. All the DPRK had to promise to do was disarm. And they said, no, we won't do that. So there was one round where Trump did end the military drills. They began right after that. They continue almost every month. The military drills, they call them decapitation drills. Their aim is to practice to try to wipe out the leadership in North Korea. At the same time, it has led to a much higher level of militarization in the economy of South Korea and to incredibly harsh austerity plans that are having quite an impact in South Korea. U.S. rearmament and military alliances in not only South Korea, but also in Japan and in Taiwan are moving ahead very aggressively and are very dangerous. Dangerous especially to North Korea, to the DPRK, which feels that it's directly aimed at them, and that they remember that the Korean War was really a war of how to stop China. That at that time, the U.S. felt the way into China was through Korea, and they were stopped by literally millions of Chinese soldiers helping with Korea to draw the line. They were able to draw it at the demarcation line between North and South now. But there's real fear in Korea, I will say, North and South, of a new round of war coming. And they take very seriously. DPRK said, we are building, that we no longer think that reunification is on the table. We're retightening our strategic relations with both Russia and China. And they certainly are moving fast to do that.
And my question about, are you predicting a U.S. war against China? And if so, by when?
Oh, well, I'm actually not predicting it. The generals issued some statement last year saying there would be war with China by 2025. That's, that demarcation's coming pretty quick to the end of the year. And then others are saying 2028. That's what generals and military planners are supposed to do. They can only sell their weapons if they tell you it's needed for the next round of war coming soon. The only thing that has given them pause each time is that China has more and more the ability to defend itself, and they let that be known. So U.S. sends more and more aircraft carriers into the South China Sea, more fleets, and China buzzes right over them, around them, does backflips in front of U.S. planes. All of that is a way of saying we can and will defend ourselves. And each time it gives pause. I hope that continues.
If I can ask for clarification, North Korea is, after all, a nuclear ballistic missile power. So is this war against North Korea going to be a nuclear war?
Well, again, that's what the U.S. threatens, and that is what Korea responds with. That is what the DPRK responds with. They say, if you hit us, we will hit back, and we have the capacity now to hit the west coast of the U.S. So that is meant to give pause to U.S. military planners. That is its intention, and also North Korea always says, we will not strike first, but, we will hit back. So I don't know. It's a very dangerous world.
We'll continue that discussion, I'm sure. Next up is Jim, followed by Sheila.
Yes, thank you. So now that the Nobel Regime Change Prize has gone to Machado, as we all know here for sure, the situation in Venezuela, I think, is very dire. As I assess, the left here is probably going to be able to rally a little bit. The liberals are absolutely confused about defending Venezuela. And so therefore, this country is really not going to be able to help much. The question I have is BRICS evolved far enough that there'll be enough support for China? And I think Russia by itself couldn't stop it. But if China gets in and they are motivated, they've got $1 billion invested in drilling oil in a Venezuelan lake right now. Hard to imagine them letting the United States just wipe out that capacity. I think that this confrontation coming up prior to any shooting is going to be historic, because I can't remember when the U.S. was going after such a big prize that there was the possibility of its imperialism being stopped. What do you think about that scenario as it's developing? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I think in Venezuela, there is a sharp move to defend themselves, to absolutely reorganize the people's militia to more than 5 million, every neighborhood, every block. They take it very seriously, and they say it will be a people's defense. I think the U.S. has no plan with a few thousand troops to invade Venezuela. What they're more thinking of are the kind of attack, in my opinion, that they made on Iran, on Yemen, on Lebanon, which they threaten against Korea, which is a kind of a decapitation. Can they make a surprise attack on Venezuela against the leadership, against the elected government? That would be disorienting in Venezuela. I think the Venezuelan people are responding to that in the best way by mobilizing the entire population into a defense force, so that even were such a thing to go ahead, what gets privatized or how the U.S. takes over, if anything, they would face a far more radical government and a far more organized force. There are relations with both Russia and China. Whether that's sufficient to stop this, I have no way of knowing. I'm not a military strategist. I think Venezuela, in reorganizing everything from the people's communes to all different vehicles in an even more left direction, means that they take their security seriously. They're not depending on here in the U.S., but they are telling us our obligation is to defend them and to oppose every kind of, I think the European imperialists, by naming Machado to the Nobel Peace Prize, are saying they are down with anything that Trump plans to do. This is the richest source of oil and gas. Venezuela is the richest. So they've lost that access to Russia. They certainly are eyeing Venezuela, and they're all for, they would be 100% behind. I mean, Machado is really a sort of a two-bit politician who's for every form of violence and coup and for completely aligning herself with the U.S. She has no credibility whatsoever. So giving her the Peace Prize is just saying they're down with the plan against Venezuela. Now Trump's angry because he didn't get it, but that's another story.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And I would just add that Iran just came out and said that if the U.S. attacks Venezuela, there will be consequences for U.S. assets in West Asia. So Venezuela doesn't stand alone. Next up is Sheila, followed by Judith.
Thanks. Hi, Sarah, fellow East Coaster. Thanks so much for the talk. I have a question about China in Africa. If you could compare how China's businesses and money lending compares to, let's say, the IMF, and also, is China involved at all in the killing going on in Congo over coltan, the wars going on in Congo? Thanks.
There have been all kinds of, I'm just trying to think here. Hold on a minute. Several books have been, I think Carlos Martinez is maybe the best one in terms of short answers to, but China's loans in Africa, first of all, are rather small. The majority of loans to Africa, more than 85%, are Western banks, along with the IMF and World Bank. They're old loans that get turned over again and again and again. China's loans are very attractive because they are at half the interest rate. They're very flexible. They are for development, not just for kind of handing money out to the person who is in charge at that moment. I mean, they're a big source of corruption, the way the Western loans were given in Africa. They really were intended for lack of development, not for specific development projects. Now, the coal train in Congo, I saw an interesting report on this because it something like 80%, more than 80%, the great majority of the workforce that scoops out coal train, it's literally by the bucket in the most toxic way of people literally working without clothes, without shoes, without gloves, without protection. And it is bought by US corporations. China went in and mechanized the coal train. It's a very small workforce because it's mechanized. But one of these anti-China groups took that figure and said, majority of workers producing coal train are completely exploited. Therefore, China is to blame. No, China actually is not to blame. They help to mechanize, and that is the most productive part, but it actually employs very few workers because it's mechanized. So it gives every country in Africa the choice: will they use mechanization, or will they do it in the really old-fashioned way of really raw material produced in ways that exploit labor completely? And it's a big divide. Who will control this? There's a lot in Congo that also has to do with the role of Rwanda, that many charge acts as a kind of a proxy for British imperialism in East Africa, and that they have a real interest in dividing Congo, and particularly in taking the wealthiest in terms of raw material and dividing it off from Congo. So there's a lot that's been written on Congo and the efforts to break it up and the effort to keep it undeveloped and sort of in the back pocket of British imperialism, particularly. The US, of course, has their lock stock with any of the imperialist powers in this, but it's especially the British that are doing this through Rwanda. I hope that answers it. If I were speaking on this right now, I might have the actual figures on both those things, but I think there's a lot that's available online that does explain the role of British forces and through Rwanda in the efforts to break up Congo.
Right. Thank you, Sheila. And if Sarah, and if someone who has access to a link to Carlos Martinez's book, please put that in the chat. That would be a good reference in this respect. Judith Osterman, you're up next, followed by Richard Wright. Judith, are you there?
I think she might have dropped.
Oh, okay, then Richard, it's your turn, please.
Thank you. I'm going to preface this for.
Wait, excuse me, I had trouble muting.
There we go.
Unmuting.
Okay, Richard,
defer back to her.
just wait a second, and Judith is back on. So Judith, it's all yours. 2 minutes of fame.
Yeah, okay, thanks. All right, I just wanted, well, first I want to say that I think the United States is actually does intend to make war on China, but their primary objective is to weaken it rather than to invade the country. And the way they're doing it is by they want to disrupt the land and sea routes so that China is unable to trade outside the country. And they use the main fighting force of America is terrorists, usually Muslim terrorists. Anyway, what I wanted to ask you was, Europe is like psychotically afraid of an invasion by Russia, and they're drumming up this fear of Russia, and they're preparing for war with Russia, and actually Russia has said in regard to the Tomahawk missile thing, they've said that that a Tomahawk missile can be nuclear armed, and they know that the United States that Ukraine can't send them without United States help. They come from the United States, so if they do launch a tomahawk on Moscow or beyond, they will assume that it's America, and since they don't know if it's nuclear or not,
2
they will
minutes.
respond as if it's nuclear. Okay, my question is, how serious do you think the European preparation for war with Russia is? Do you think it's just to bog Russia down, or is there an actual threat? Okay, thanks.
There's an actual threat. There's always a threat that war could go further than anticipated. And this is war against all the NATO powers, whose are nuclear powers themselves, Britain and France, Germany, I could go on. They have nuclear weapons, as does Russia. And so, yes, this could go further. And they're threatening it, and Russia responds back. It is an effort to bog Russia down, and in so doing, to kind of tie it up. But so far, at least so it appears, Russia's trade, its exchanges with other countries, its ability to maneuver is continuing. So I don't know what to say, except that this war is continuing because the US and the European powers don't want it to end. They do want it to bog Russia down, to try to bleed it out, to try to still, they're very hopeful still of regime change. Could it drag on long enough that the government there, there's some kind of collapse? Those are their hopes and their plans. But in the meantime, it's dragging all of Europe down. I mean, the austerity that's going on in Europe, and if you talk to anyone from Europe, they'll talk about hospitals that no longer work and all sorts of infrastructure that is in decay, because everything is going into the military and or going to the Ukraine for weapons that end up almost right away on the gray market and are resold. The corruption in Ukraine is enormous. So, there's a lot of money at stake in all of this, and they say bogging Russia down, but the real contractors in this are making money hand over fist the whole time. So if goods are looted, they don't care. If they never even get past the landing, they don't really care. They're making money off of it. That is the problem, and it is costing the workers in Europe more and more. It may lead to a real clash because it's waking up workers in Europe who find they didn't have to really fight for years to have a pretty good standard of living. And now they're going to have to fight their own ruling class for everything, including bread. I mean, this is, in Britain, there was a slogan that the workers have to choose between heating and eating because the price of fuel was so high. That's a direct response to cutting off the cheap gas and oil from Russia, buying now very expensive fuel from the US. So these are the choices that they're imposing on European workers.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We're just about out of time. We have one more hand, and if
And
I
you
could
have
prevail on you.
You never asked me your question.
I'll get to that.
Okay.
But Stan Woods, my
Yeah,
comrade from the Peace and Freedom Party.
Yeah, and I knew Sarah. I first met her 50 years ago. We're both dating ourselves at a conference in New York. Anyway, quick question. Next Saturday will be, maybe it not won't be, but it'll be huge. Billed to be the largest demonstration in U.S. history, the No Kings Day demonstrations. There's many things good about it, but there's some dramatic omissions. Like, for example, no mention of war and peace issues. And here in the Bay Area, some of us are going to try to rectify that, and many people have in the past by having hundreds of, anti-war signs and so on and so forth. But it's really incredible that the main organizers want to talk about Trump's crimes in the U.S., but not his international crimes. Any thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, the No King's Day will involve people all over the U.S., that's true, on basic economic issues. But it really is an initiative of the Democratic Party, and it intentionally cuts out any international issues. The last round, actually the only international demand they had was for NATO.
Yeah. Hands off NATO.
Right, hands off NATO. It was not hands off Gaza. It was not hands off Cuba, Venezuela. It was hands off NATO. So, and that was their only international, which showed a lot about their direction. Now, there are a lot of people who go because it is a forum of people in motion to raise also international issues. And that's important because they're kind of going against the grain, which I think you should, frankly, because if you just are raising the economic issues, it's a fraud. It's really a fraud. The very Democratic Party that was all for war on Gaza and for austerity and is doing nothing really to fight back right now. No King's Day is a way for them of rallying their electoral base, not of really doing anything to block Trump. They're not. So I think people should take advantage of it because there's demonstrations everywhere to bring in more political slogans. I do think that's a way to handle it, but keep in mind who this is, and they want to take it away from the movement that's been in the streets for Palestine.
Okay, I think we're just about out of time. So, Sarah, I would like to give you the opportunity to wrap up, and perhaps you might comment on some practical organizing tips that will come out of this discussion, because the discussion was very deep and profound, and particularly the question of Mr. Putin. Putin, well, let's put it this way. Some of these people that are organizing for the No King's Day, they say Trump is worse than Hitler, and Putin is worse than Trump. It's very deeply ingrained in American politics, and it's something that the left does not necessarily have a good response to it. I think we have a better response to the China issue, but on the issue of the demonization of Putin, how do you organize around that issue? And if you could sum up, please.
Well, I think one way is to say he's not the issue. U.S. war is. NATO war is the issue. And to refuse to accept the attacks on anyone, always the U.S. strategy is to raise up one individual, could be Maduro, it could be Saddam Hussein, it doesn't matter who it is. One person represents the whole country. And if they're made into enough of a demon, it justifies every war and every reactionary slur. So all of Russia today resisting a U.S. takeover and a complete dislocation of their economy. Instead, they flip it and they say, well, it's because Putin is a dictator. Well, he happens to be the elected, head of state, but they won't tell you that. It's always, he's a dictator and somehow the U.S. is for democracy. And I think we got to consciously always flip it to say, no, we're against U.S. NATO war everywhere, and we're against endless weapons for war, which come overwhelmingly from the United States. So whether we're talking about 800 bases around the world, or the U.S. role in Palestine, or in Ukraine, or against China, as much as we can keep it on target, that the danger in the world today is U.S. imperialism, its bases, its military expenditures, its efforts at coups, and destabilization. I think almost right away, usually people will agree with you. It's interesting. And when you try it, somebody will say one thing and you say the other, and they'll say, oh, well, that is true. The U.S. is endlessly at war. And they'll tell you they're not for any of the wars. They'll use the terminology, but they're not for war anywhere. I mean, consider Iran, which I can't think of a country that has been more demonized for 40 years. And yet, if you ask the average person who will say all kinds of things against Iran, you think the U.S. should go to war against Iran? Oh, no, that they're not for. So I think we have to know that there is a profound distrust of U.S. government wars, and we should always go in that direction when we're talking to anyone.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everybody for some wonderful comments and questions. See you next week when we talk about Nepal.
Oh yeah, I'm going to tune in, I think, for that.